This is the primal scream of a dying regime.
Pray for our enemies, because we're going medieval on these people. You're just not got a free shot on all these networks lying about the people. The people have had a belly full of it. I know you don't like hearing that. I know you try to do everything in the world to stop that, but you're not going to stop it. It's going to happen.
And where do people like that go to share the big lie? MAGA media. I wish in my soul, I wish that any of these people had a conscience.
Ask yourself, what is my task and what is my purpose? If that answer is to save my country, this country will be saved.
War Room. Here's your host, Stephen K. Bannon.
Ben Harnwell at the helm on Steve Bannon's War Room. Welcome this evening. Got a great guest that we've been trying to get on the show for some time, David Pyne, who's the National Deputy Executive Director of the Task Force on National and Homeland Security. We'll be digging in a little bit, not starting the show with this, but talking about the threat that the electromagnetic pulse, the EMP, could pose to Americans. We'll be digging on that in just a few moments. First, however, the topical event in the news has been the annual NATO summit at Ankara in Turkey this week. Everyone's seen President Trump there doing what President Trump does best, which is dominating the debate. And I wanted to ask David Pyne, who has a background in US forces, former advisor to Senator Mike Lee as well. I wanted to ask him what he thinks the dynamic poses to the United States long-term relationship with America's European NATO allies and with the European Union as well, with a newly dominant Turkey. That, I think, is a hinge factor. Turkey, I think President Erdogan, for a number of years, has sought very hard to leverage his geopolitical advantages, being there on the Bosphorus, and is trying to play a number of spheres off one another. It's got continental Europe and the long-term strategic interests of Turkey joining the European Union, which would be the first Islamic nation to do so. And you might remember, folks, 15, 20 years ago, Angela Merkel and Pope Benedict XVI were pushing very hard on the Christian Democrat elements, the largest group in the European Parliament, the largest political force in the European Parliament in those days. They were both pushing very hard to let Turkey in. So you have, on the one hand, Erdogan's desires to bring Turkey into the European Union. You also have his relationship with the Islamic countries in the Middle East. And you also got the fact that he's a NATO member. And I think he has done really very well. I thought he'd done very well to balance all of these rival blocs against one another before this NATO conference. David Pyne, we've all seen just how well, I think he's probably the only leader in there, apart from President Trump, to have escaped from President Trump's lashing of NATO. The only person to escape to that conference, I think, with a greater authority than when he went in. Tell me, you're an astute observer of these things. How do you appraise Erdogan's handling of these geopolitical dynamics, and what does it mean for the United States? To come back to my question, its long-term relationship with Europe predicated around a newly dominant Turkey.
Hey, Ben, it's great to be with you. Thanks so much for having me on your show. I think there was a lot of news that came out at the NATO summit. Turkey, as you mentioned, is led by President Erdogan, who's essentially an autocratic leader, who's suppressed his opposition and stayed in power for over 2 decades, really almost as long as Russian President Putin. I think he came to power around 2002 or so. And he's been an Islamist leader. He's the only Islamist leader of NATO. Turkey used to be led by moderate, Islam or Muslim leaders, and Erdogan is not that. He has one of the biggest militaries in NATO, probably the second biggest military in NATO. So I think President Trump respects that. He knows that Turkey has a huge army. Obviously, Turkey is a non-nuclear power, so it's a medium power, but it's one of the strongest medium powers in the region, and one that he views as successful in, of course, helping overthrow Assad and put Syria in the hands of al-Shara, who is a very controversial figure. I personally have trouble stomaching him, but many in U.S. foreign policy circles think that he's an improvement over Assad. I would say that's not the case. But Turkey is, because Turkey does have this strong conventional military, President Trump is talking about selling Turkey about 5 F-35s. That's something that Israel, obviously Netanyahu, opposes. But Turkey is, under Erdogan, it has been probably more successful than ever before since the Ottoman days, when it controlled, areas from Palestine and Syria and Lebanon and Iraq and part of Syria, much of Syria. That's never going to happen again, obviously, but Turkey is more powerful, I think, today than at any time than it has been since 1918.
Well, let's go back to Kemal Ataturk, the founder of modern secular Turkey, and a very convinced secularist. Would you suggest that Erdogan now has brought, over the last 20 years, Turkey to a greater regional influence than it had in the days of Ataturk himself?
I think so. Yeah, Ataturk obviously was a hero in Turkey because he was able to, regain control of modern day Turkey, which was carved up under at the end of World War I. It was supposed to be carved up and into a much smaller state than it is today. He was able to reverse that through a successful war against the Greeks and other powers in the region. So I would say that Erdogan is more successful, and Turkey is more influential today than it has been, again, for over 100 years.
Let me ask you, because Erdogan was actually imprisoned, I think, in his younger days for his agitation in favor of the Muslim Brotherhood, if I remember that correctly. And a lot of people were suggesting that his convinced desire to take Turkey out of the secular fold and take it back into a more explicitly religiously Islamic mold was only going to last for Erdogan's duration in power, and that it would revert to its secularist setting that had pretty much governed the country for the 80 or so years beforehand. I think now that expectation looks a little bit optimistic. What do you think about that? Do you think there's any sliding back towards secularism in the post-Erdogan future? or do you think it's pretty much this is its new setting now as a quite a convinced Islamic country, not of the same degree perhaps as the Islamic countries in the Middle East, but at least from the European perspective?
Well, I would argue Turkey is part of the Middle East, of course, but yeah, you're absolutely correct. It's not as Islamist as Syria or Iraq or Iran, because it does have a secular tradition. I don't think, I think that Erdogan's Islamist party is, has a pretty secure hold on Turkey today. So, my default prediction would be that continues for the foreseeable future. But of course, once he dies, it's certainly possible that maybe a U.S.-backed secular party could regain control. Obviously, Turkey was led by secular generals and other autocratic leaders, but they were much more pro-Western. Erdogan is kind of, he's kind of hedged his bets. He's made very clear that he's enthusiastic about Turkey joining the Sino-Russian military alliance and having its foot on both sides, essentially part of the NATO alliance, which is led by the U.S., and the Sino-Russian alliance, which is the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. So Turkey is a observer state, I believe. So it's kind of 2 runs down the ladder to SCO membership. So that's something that's concerned the U.S. that he has pretty warm relations with Russia and Ukraine. Russia and China. Although he has sold some kind of drones and kind of some level of weapon systems to Ukraine. Obviously not super pro-Russian, but certainly much more pro-Russian than most NATO countries. In terms of Turkey's post-Erdogan course, it's hard to know for sure, but I would anticipate that he would designate a successor, and that Islamist successor would continue to rule Turkey in his absence.
I want to move on to the wider situation in NATO generally after this conference this week in Ankara. However, on this point, 15, 20 years ago, when it was quite a more realistic proposition that Turkey was going to join the European Union, and as I mentioned before, figures like Angela Merkel and Benedict XVI were quite heavily pushing in that direction. There was a lot of political pressure from the European Union and indeed the United States around that time on Turkey and on the Turkish military specifically to withdraw from power on the basis that the military's presence either actively ruling Turkey or the potential that it might intervene was destabilizing democracy. And there were criticisms made at the time that was a somewhat naive intervention for the United States and for Europe to be making, because it was the very military that was underwriting the secularist political power structure of Turkey, and that too much democracy would allow exactly what Erdogan has done to happen. Just before we move on to the wider NATO considerations, do you think, with the benefit of hindsight, the European Union's and America's intervention there to basically act in such a way that the Turkish military was definitively castrated as a political power in Turkey was ill-advised?
Absolutely ill-advised. We kind of did the same thing in Iran by withdrawing our support from the Shah when it was he was being overthrown by the current Islamist regime, the Ayatollah Khomeini. I think that was definitely ill-advised. President Bush kind of had a democratization drive in the Middle East, and we saw the results of that. One of the first casualties was with the Turkish secular parties, which had governed Turkey, as you mentioned, for some 84 to 86 years. That was a big mistake, because now Turkey is not firmly in the Western camp. It's got relations with Islamist regimes that are, we are not super supportive of. So, the question is, do you support Democrats wherever they are, or do you support folks that are pro-U.S. and pro-Western? And I would always go with the pro-Western regimes. That's, I think, in terms of U.S. national security interests, that would be the smart thing to do. We'd rather have the Shah, an autocratic Shah in charge instead of the illiberal regime of the Islamists in Iran, and certainly that's the case in Turkey as well. If the price of democracy is a less pro-Western, a less pro-U.S. government of another country, I'll typically side with the pro-Westerners against the quote-unquote Democrats.
That's a perfect point. Just to pause on, David, bear with me. I'm just going to give a quick shout out at this time of the show to our sponsors. Start off with Birch Gold. They have produced a special limited edition 1 ounce silver round to commemorate America's 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. If you are interested in obtaining this limited edition coin, then speak to Philip Patrick and his team. Text Bannon to 989898. That coin is available for qualifying purchases of $10,000 or more. And ask Philip Patrick, when you get him on the phone, one of the world's experts in giving advice on how to convert an old 401k into a physical IRA in gold. Ask him to expand on what gold has done over the last 10 years. 10 years ago, spot price was at $1,200. Now it's at $4,000, having just touched very recently $4,500. Ask him where he thinks gold is going to be going over the next 10 years. Tell him you don't want to miss out. Text Bannon once again to 989898. And when you get Philip Patrick on the other end of the phone, ask him about that special limited edition America 250 1 ounce silver round, because when they're gone, folks, they are gone. Also, quick shout out to Tax Network USA. Perhaps you have back taxes due, perhaps you haven't filed in years, and these things are keeping you awake at night. The IRA can garnish your wages, levy your bank account, seize your retirement, and even your own home. If you owe or haven't filed, it's not a question of if the IRS will act, it's when. So call 1-800-958-1000. Once again, 1-800-958-1000, or visit tnusa.com/Bannon. Get a free discovery call. Won't cost you anything, but it will leave you with a greater sense of peace of mind once you know what your options are. It's not a pleasant position, folks, to be in when you think the IRS might seize everything that you have. And of course, if you try phoning them and representing yourself, you will waive your own rights. So once again, 1-800-958-1000. or visit tnusa.com/Bannon. All right, back with David Pyne. David, so back to the NATO conference. President Trump has been quite clear, and his ambassador to NATO, Matthew Whitaker, also holding the line here, that NATO members need to hike up their defense spending to 5%. How serious do you think this goal is for the US administration? Because I have a follow-on question about this.
Well, I think that President Trump has an outstanding national security strategy that he issued in December and a national defense strategy in January. And essentially what that document says is that the preeminent focus of U.S. national security strategy will be on securing the Western Hemisphere against foreign superpowers, encroaching superpowers like Russia and China. Obviously, a secondary focus on the Western Pacific to deter Chinese aggression against our allies, including non-treaty allies like Taiwan. But then in terms of Europe and the Middle East, it essentially says that we will outsource primary responsibility for the conventional defense and deterrence of the regions to European NATO allies and Israel, respectively. So what that means in terms of NATO is that President Trump wants to see our NATO allies, step up in terms of military spending to provide the bulk, if not perhaps even all of the ground forces, certainly, but also most of the air forces. So the U.S. Essentially what President Trump's overall vision is, and it's unclear if this will ever be fully implemented, is that by the end of, reportedly by the end of next year, he wants this transformation to take place. And so we're envisioning the withdrawal of perhaps 20,000, perhaps a lot more U.S. troops, ground forces from Europe. Air assets, we've already started withdrawing some air assets from NATO. And President Trump has made some, and not just Trump, but also Secretary of War Hegseth and Vice President J.D. Vance have kind of made clear that the U.S., the U.S. security guarantees for our European allies are not ironclad as they were under the Biden administration, but they're essentially conditional on, what's in the U.S. national security interest, which meaning that if Eastern European NATO member states provoke Russia to attack them, perhaps by hosting Ukrainian, drone attacks and strikes on Russia, that the U.S. will not necessarily come to their aid. Certainly we will in terms of arms shipments, but in terms of actual ground fighting forces or, defending them against any Russian incursions or invasions, that's not 100%. And so I think that's very useful because that kind of encourages our European allies to realize that if the U.S., certainly our nuclear umbrella is still there for the most part, but in terms of conventional defenses, they need to rely on their own forces. And so Germany obviously is, saying that they're going to step up to the plate. They're talking about having the largest military outside of Turkey and the United States within Europe. Talking about having the French maybe have a nuclear umbrella over Germany. Poland has also expressed interest in the French extending their nuclear umbrella over Poland as kind of a backstop against the U.S. Perhaps not coming to their aid in the event of some kind of war with Russia. But another thing being talked about is that Whitaker, Ambassador Whitaker has stated, is that the U.S. is actually very interested in seeing Germany replace the U.S. as the supreme allied commander of Europe. So a German general would replace us. That makes a lot of sense. Germany and Turkey are the two largest NATO members in Europe outside of obviously the U.S. Turkey actually has more people than Germany at this point. But Germany makes more sense because they're an entirely European country, whereas Turkey is primarily a Middle Eastern country. And so I think that would be very useful. And then probably the most important for me is that there have been limited discussions within the White House that we could also pull out of NATO's military command structure. So that makes a lot of sense if we're going to give up the NATO Supreme Commander position.
Do you want to see that? Would you like to see that? Would you like to see the United States withdraw from the military command structure of NATO?
Yes, I think that would be an excellent decision that would put America first. I think that what I've been advocating since at least 2019 is the Europeization of NATO, meaning that NATO would be transformed into a primarily European-led alliance led by France, the UK, and Germany primarily. And that would give, the U.S. could still come to NATO's defense in the event of war, but we wouldn't be bound to do so. We're outside the military command structure. And this precedent occurred with France, of course, from 1966 to 1991. there were no NATO military bases in France because France was not part of the NATO military alliance. They remained part of the NATO.
Because General de Gaulle was extremely skeptical, not only of NATO as a concept, but also American influence within NATO. And I would like to suggest that it might have taken, 40 or so years to come to pass. But anyone who was watching, basically, which was a NATO's provocation of Russia to invade Ukraine to justify its own continued existence, right? Anyone who had paid attention to what de Gaulle was saying in the 50s and 60s will probably have a quite smile on their face. Look, let me just ask you this, right? We'll come back and pick this up after the break. But seeing as you mentioned Russia and the presence of Russia earlier on in your analysis, it's difficult to see what the existential need for NATO is post fall of the Berlin Wall, right? Because I get the idea, the argument of pooling risk and pooling resources, but I don't see how that argument works when the risks are asymmetric and the resource contribution is asymmetric as well. And it's asymmetric in the wrong direction, because the countries, or the country least at risk of being attacked, say, for example, by Russia, is the country, which is America. It's almost inconceivable that Russia would actually lay a direct attack on the United States. That country that's least at risk is paying by far the most of the amount of money into the system. So you have two asymmetric risks there. And the countries that are most at risk are paying the least. There is no shock that I think America can face where they're going to say, thank God it's the Latvians. They're coming to rescue us. We're saved. It's not going to happen, folks. NATO is a hoax. Back with David Pyne.
Still America's Voice family.
Are you on Getter yet? No?
What are you waiting for?
It's free.
It's uncensored, and it's where all the biggest voices in conservative media are speaking out.
Download the Getter app right now. It's totally free. It's where I put up exclusively all of my content 24 hours a day. You want to know what Steve Bannon's thinking? Go to Getter.
That's right. You can follow all of your favorites. Steve Bannon, Charlie Kirk, Jack Posobiec,
and so many more.
Download the Getter app now.
Sign up for free and be part of the movement.
Welcome back. David Pyne. Let me ask you this about the famous 5%, because I think it's a great ambition for America to have, especially if it's going to seriously pursue in your words, the Europeanization of NATO. And I think it would be great for NATO, it'd be great for America were that to happen. And the 5%, I mean, I frankly don't think 5% of all the European NATO countries is going to be nearly enough, but to cover the shortfall. But put that to the side one moment. One thing I have, being based here in Italy, that concerns me when I asked you how seriously do you think the administration is really working towards this target, is how the Europeans are quite successfully assuming that the Americans aren't paying too closely attention to the details. Let me give an example of what's happening here in Italy. This is how they're going to make their 5%. And I'm not inventing any of this. They're now transferring over pensions to people who served in the armed forces as direct military expenditure. They're transferring over the Coast Guard, the expense of the Coast Guard, to get up to this 5%. They are they're building a bridge between Sicily and the mainland peninsula, and they're chalking that up to their 5%. Oh, it's horrific, David. It's absolutely horrific. And they're getting away with it because nobody in the administration is saying, hang on, let's open the books. We're going to send over a few generals and a few accountants. And we're gonna look at exactly how you're getting yourselves to this 5%. which Germany can't do anyway, even if it has ambitions. It's borderline in recession anyway. So coming back to my question to you is, how serious do you think America is about the Europeans getting to 5% in order to get to that Europeanization of NATO? I would think if America is serious, it really needs to be a little bit more engaged on what the Europeans are doing with. Look, no one does dodgy accounting better than Europeans. They are world experts at this. And my general, if I could feed this back over to you before we move on to the EMP thing, it would be this. They are going to run, the wily Europeans are going to run rings around you unless you actually hold their feet to the fire and work out what they're doing with their expenses, because they can get to 5% just through dodgy account, through fiddling the books, right? It doesn't mean that they're going to really seriously take in their own hands their own responsibilities to defend themselves when they think that America, being a military industrial complex, will hop over the Atlantic at the drop of a handkerchief and bail them out again. Give me your thoughts and analysis on that, if you wouldn't mind, please.
Great question. Well, I first want to talk about what Trump envisioned for U.S. military spending when he came to power. In March of 2025, he talked about cutting the U.S. military budget by 50%. He envisioned these grand bargains, peace treaties with Russia and China. He was going to end the war in Ukraine, obviously within the first 24 hours of his presidency. And obviously, it's almost 18 months. It'll be 18 months. I think on the 24th of July, and there's no end to that war in sight. But essentially what I'm saying, what you mentioned in the last segment at the end was, I think, very insightful. And that is that President Biden made the deliberate decision to provoke Russia to invade Ukraine. He was given the option on December 7th of 2021 by President Putin. All you have to do is hand me a written guarantee that Ukraine will never join NATO. NATO will never be expanded eastward. And he vetoed that with the full knowledge that that would result in a Russian invasion. So what we have today is, as you mentioned, NATO leaders are trying to justify NATO's existence by provoking, war and military military confrontation with the Russian Federation, which is the mightiest nuclear superpower on the planet, despite the fact that Putin, just the month before he invaded, actually it's 2 months, I think it was December 17th of 2021, he provided NATO and the U.S. with mutual security treaties, which would help to ensure peace between Russia and NATO for many decades to come. And Biden told him to pound sand. Trump, I think, if he were president at that time, he would have negotiated some kind of peace deal with Russia that would have ensured that Russia never felt the need to invade Ukraine. And so I think more importantly than 5% military spending is that we reduce our confrontation level with the Russian Federation as a NATO alliance. And the way to do that, of course, President Trump had at one point, he had, I think, a 28-point peace plan, which was pretty reasonable. Only 3 of those points were probably unacceptable in their face to Russia. And then that got watered down into the Zelensky plan. And, then there was the Anchorage summit, and that went pretty well. And then he had a confrontation with Zelensky in the White House in October, in which, he told him to accept Russia's peace terms. But I think that's really the key to NATO's ultimate security in avoiding World War III. And I think Steve Bannon has been pretty much a leader on that, hammering home that point as well. But in terms of the 5%, it is very important to the Trump administration, the White House, that European countries meet that goal. I think that there's very little chance of that being done. Certainly, as you mentioned, Italy is having some creative accounting to try to pretend that it's doing that, but it's still likely to fall short. And I think that's it's a pretty unrealistic objective. The U.S., obviously, with $1.5 trillion, if we do pass that budget the Department of War, then we will get in kind of the 5% range. My initial complaint is that we can't demand from our allies to do something that we're not willing to do. And Trump is actually, to his credit, he's put his money where his mouth is, and he's trying to get us to 5% GDP defense spending as well.
Just to go back a bit, when you were talking about the origins of the war in Ukraine, some analysts think that the origins of that war more fundamentally was about 6 months before Putin was provoked into invading, because of statements that you might remember that Emmanuel Macron, the French president, had said that NATO was dead and on life support, basically because it didn't have a reason for existing anymore. And lo and behold, in the manufactured provoked crisis, NATO is now front and center. So just give me your take on that. Is that crazy conspiracy theory stuff, or do you draw the dots between that, David Pyne?
Well, President Trump himself stated, according to John Bolton twice, he told his top cabinet members he wanted the U.S. to pull out of NATO. So he was a visionary on that front. He's kind of pulled back a little bit from that. As I mentioned, he's considering pulling out of the U.S. military command structure, but not pulling out of NATO itself. In terms of Macron, he was making statements like that. NATO was lacking a purpose because we did have decent relations with Russia, and President Richard Nixon understood that it's in every country's interest to have good relations with your adversaries. Did you have a comment?
I did have a comment. I actually think it would be in the benefit of the United States and the European members of NATO and of Russia if America did actually formally leave the alliance. I think NATO now is a destabilized post fall of the Berlin Wall. I think NATO is a destabilizing influence for world peace, and I would cite as Exhibit A in that the war in Ukraine. Of course, you suggest that President Trump has backed down ever so slightly on his original goals. But let's remember that the Senate passed an act, Congress passed an act, Senate promoted in the Senate, which was to prohibit a U.S. president's ability to withdraw the United States from NATO. And the primary sponsor of that legislation was Marco Rubio, the present Secretary of State. So I will just leave that. I'll just leave that parked there. Come back to that at a later date. But I think President Trump's original position was the superior one. Look, we've got you on this show not only to pick your brains on the geopolitics, but also to talk about your day job, which we'll do in just a quick moment. After the quick shout out once again to the show's sponsors. Start off with Birch Gold. I gave out the details of the special commemorative 1 ounce silver round before. If you want to get your hands on that, speak to Philip Patrick. Text Bannon, BANNON, to 989898. And when you get Philip on the line, just ask him to break down what the details are and how you could shift over your savings into an IRA in physical gold, and he'll walk you through that. Also, quick shout out to America's Health Share. They are great experts in reducing Americans' healthcare costs by an average of 60%. Policies that are accepted everywhere, coverage that is accepted everywhere, and that gives you the great security and peace of mind. So you can say goodbye to out-of-network limitations. You're not going to get those with America's Health Share. They can offer monthly coverage for as low as $68. And in addition to getting great healthcare coverage, you won't get the complications and price gouging from the standard mammoth healthcare providers. If you want to know more, there's the website right in front of you. Go on to freedomforhealth.org Bannon to learn more. Once again, freedomforhealth.org/Bannon, and you will get a first month absolutely free with promo code Bannon. There you go. freedomforhealth.org/Bannon, promo code Bannon. Okay, back to David Pyne. Now, David, your day job, for many, many years, you've been working in Congress, in the then Department for Defense, in the Missile Defense Agency. Your area of specialization is preparing America for the threat of an electromagnetic pulse, an EMP. Tell us a bit about that. And do you still think after the years, because I would quite comfortably say, one of America's leading experts on this issue, national expert on this issue, with all that you've been doing over many, many years, do you think America is still slightly complacent about the risks posed by an EMP? And just perhaps say a quick few words to your fellow Americans how such a thing might arise, what it would take, and what would the devastation arising out of that be?
Yeah, another great question. So, as you mentioned, I'm the Deputy Executive Director of the Task Force on National Homeland Security. We've been in existence for 15 years as a congressionally authorized board to warn Americans and policymakers about the existential threat posed by electromagnetic pulse attack by our enemies. Electromagnetic pulse is, we found out at the Starfish Prime test in 1963 in the Pacific that it can take out, electronic systems, electrical systems from, a great distance, 800 miles in that instance, and as few as one super EMP warhead, which is essentially a nuclear warhead that's been specially designed to maximize its EMP effects, which again are capable of taking out critical infrastructure in the United States and other countries that they might be used against. Just one warhead could potentially turn out the lights and shut down all of our electronic systems throughout the continental United States. So there are, we assess that up to 4 different countries have that capability. Russia, obviously, foremost. They developed that capability in the 1990s.
Just wind that back a little bit, right? One nuclear warhead with a range of 800 miles. That's atmospheric. It doesn't need to be a direct attack on New York City. This could be in the middle, of the Atlantic or the Pacific or something like that. One specially honed nuclear warhead maximized for EMP effects, you said would basically take out the whole of the electric communications across the whole of the continental North America, right? So that's no electronic banking, that's dead. No internet, that would be dead. No cell phone coverage, that would be dead in a single instance. So that would be like massive impact for quite, in terms of the ratio between cause and effect, you'd get massive effect there from very little effort. Tell me because this is always bubbling around and people mention it and then forget about it and assume that by forgetting about it, it will never happen, treating hope as a strategy. What should America be doing in order to prepare itself for this? And is it not the same preparation that would eventually serve in any case from a natural electromagnetic pulse from a solar flare or something like that, which is arguably more probable?
Yeah, it is. So first, just to clarify, it would have to be a super EMP warhead detonated about 285 to 300 miles overhead over the center of the United States. So maybe Missouri or that region. And there are up to 4 countries that we believe have super EMP satellites or orbital nukes or, obviously nuclear intercontinental missile range missiles that could accomplish that. So yeah, you're absolutely right. It could take out all of our our food distribution system, our power, our water purification and distribution system, our internet, our communications. I mean, this is essentially a technology destroying weapon that could blast us back into the pre-electrical age. At which point, in pre-electrical age is like the 1880s. And the U.S. only was able to sustain a population of about 38 million people. So the EMP Commission, the Congressional Commission, determined that up to 90% of Americans could die from such an attack. And there's, President Trump he's been the best president we've ever had. The only one who's actually done anything to try to protect the U.S. against EMP. Unfortunately, what I've assessed needs to be done is a presidential declaration of emergency. We've seen the president declare emergencies with regards to the immigration threat, with regards to the fertilizer shortage, and other issues, the border wall, things of that nature. But he also, and I think maybe tariffs as well, but he also needs to declare a presidential state of emergency for EMP attack and nuclear ballistic missile attack. And what that would do, that would enable him to repurpose funding, congressionally approved funding that's maybe related, maybe for conventional armed forces or things of that nature, to hardening the grid, our electrical grid, against super EMP and cyber attack, but also against what you mentioned, which is the threat of super geomagnetic storms or solar flares that could also have the same and nearly as much of an impact in destroying our critical infrastructure. And that's something that's guaranteed to happen. It's actually overdue, is that we have kind of an 1859 Carrington level EMP event that's naturally occurring. I think there was maybe a movie that was made in the UK about that in the last decade or so. There's also a great movie called 1 Second After that's coming out, I think, by December, that the task force has been promoting.
Shocking. These are things that people really don't want to think about. First of all, go to My Patriot Supply and prepare that way. That's something that everyone can do right now. David Pyne, where do people go to learn more about what an EMP is, what they can do to prepare about it domestically, and what they can do to help pressure their elected representatives to get their heads down and actually do something?
Yeah, our best website is emptaskforce.us. There you can, your viewers can go to volunteer, or you can donate to the task force, and we need your support.
David Pyne, very, very grateful. We'll get that screen up. Very grateful for you sharing your geopolitical expertise with us. Come back, give us a further brief, especially on all things to do with EMPs and NATO. My thanks to Will at Real America's Voice and Vittorio Santifranco for putting the show together.